large column of Polish armored vehicles detected heading towards the Belarusian border.
Wagner.
The Polish Prime Minister sounds the alarm over Wagner troops stationed in Belarus. But not because he thinks they're headed toward Kiev, rather he fears a Russian offensive elsewhere. We discuss this in today's video, but first make sure to hit that subscribe button.
Тут на одной из передач говорили о тонком ходе нашего верховного главнокомандующего. Понятно, что Вагнера ушли в Белоруссию, чтобы там обучать белорусские вооруженные силы. На самом-то деле ведь не только и не столько. Есть такой Сувалкинский коридор. Как очень хорошо знать, что это такое.
Все хорошо знают.
Да, все хорошо знают. И вот этот Suwalki коридор, в случае чего, нам очень нужен.
So alarm bells are ringing off in Poland again, and yes, it has to do in part with Wagner's presence nearby. But it's not because of the training camps that were built for Wagner in Belarus following the Prigozhin march. It concerns a small, approximately 100-kilometer corridor between Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, which touches on two NATO countries, Poland and Lithuania. And it's called the Suwalki Gap, named after the Suwalki Agreement between Poland and Lithuania that led to a ceasefire in the Polish-Lithuanian War and established a demarcation line in the region. As you can see from this map, the corridor is the only means of transporting goods from Russia to Kaliningrad. And much like the importance of Crimea to Russia, Kaliningrad also holds the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. So fast forward to today, and the Russian invasion in February of 2022 led to the motherload of sanctions against Russia by the European Union, one of which prevents Lithuania from allowing the transport of certain goods from Russia to Kaliningrad. So you can see the problem arising here. This obviously caused a lot of anger with the Kremlin and led to a senior official, Nikolai Patrushev, to issue a threat of, and I quote, serious consequences to Lithuania. As a result, the European Union attempted to come up with a compromise to allow the continued transport of goods from Russia so as to avoid, as stated in a prominent German newspaper, avoid Russia capturing the gap and cutting the land connection between the Baltic states and the rest of NATO. And this brings us to the present situation of concern. We all know about the result of the Prigozhin march, which, I suppose much to the disappointment of the West, did not lead to a regime change in Russia, but rather to the transfer of Russia's most fearsome fighters, the Wagner group, to Belarus. And while the initial concern was the ability of Wagner to now strike at Kiev, the alarm bells which I spoke about earlier are now pointing to a different direction, and by now you can guess where I'm speaking about. So much so that the Polish Prime Minister said this in an article from the Irish Times published today. Now the situation is becoming even more dangerous. We have information that more than 100 mercenaries of the Wagner group have moved towards the Suwalki Gap near Horodna in Belarus, Morawiecki said. According to the Polish Prime Minister, this is definitely a step towards a further hybrid attack on Polish territory. They are likely to be disguised as Belarusian border guards and will help illegal immigrants enter Polish territory, destabilize Poland. But they are also likely to try to enter Polish territory posing as illegal immigrants, which creates additional risks. And if true, then we may be witnessing the same playbook that Russia used to annex Crimea in 2014, maskirovka. In fact, the BBC seemed so impressed by Russia's deception that they wrote an entire article lauding the cleverness of Russia's little green men who moved into Crimea in 2014. And here's what the article said. Surprise is a key ingredient in maskirovka, and the clandestine forces which occupied Crimea last February certainly delivered that. In the small hours, unmarked military trucks drove up filled with heavily armed men. They ordered those demonstrators to lie face down on the ground until they realized they were on the same side. Then they made them carry ammunition into the parliament. The troops, which had arrived in the dark as if by magic, with no insignia on their olive-colored uniforms, were soon nicknamed Little Green Men. We know now these guys were Russian special forces, but no one said so at the time. Denial is another vital component in maskirovka. At a press conference a few days later, Vladimir Putin coolly batted away awkward questions about where the troops came from. There are many military uniforms. Go into any shop and you can find one, he said. But were they Russian soldiers? Poker-faced, the president said the men were local self-defense units. 5 weeks later, once the annexation had been rubber-stamped by the parliament in Moscow, Putin admitted Russian troops had been deployed in Crimea after all. But the lie had served its purpose. Maskirovka is used to wrong-foot your enemies, to keep them guessing. Now, if Wagner does seize this corridor and cut the Baltics off from the rest of NATO, the question becomes, will this be the event that triggers the feared Article 5 and lead us into World War III?
There's another piece of this that I'd like to get in, and we've got a break coming up in a couple of minutes, but we'll go over it. That has to do with the phrase that we're seeing more and more chatter in the media now. It's called the Suwalki Gap.
Right.
And they're saying Prigozhin and Wagner, they're headed over to Belarus. They're manning up on the Suwalki Gap. Poland is sending materiel. They're sending APCs up to the Suwalki Gap. So we've got the map up there for folks who don't understand or aren't familiar with the area. Walk us through, what is the significance of the Suwalki Gap? What is it?
Well, this is a common access point for Russia to have access to the Baltic Sea. And basically, you have a number of countries which are involved. As a matter of fact, one of the few things I'll ever agree with Politico on, Politico called this place the most dangerous place on earth. It's like, wow, one time out of a million, Politico got something right. And they are correct. So you've got the Russians, you've got the Lithuanians, you've got the Poles, you've got NATO that has the overall responsibility regarding the security of the region, and of course the EU. So this is where all the interests of all the parties truly come together. So I think the same can be said now with all the interests of the different parties regarding keeping that gap open. It's very small, it's very compact, but a lot of things happen there. And so I think many folks recognize that there's going to be miscalculation or aggression that triggers World War III, like during the Cold War. A lot of folks think it's going to happen at this gap.